India, on one hand, is said to be the largest democracy. On the other hand, it is also inhabited by largest number of people who live below poverty line, BPL. Ground reality of life of Indian middle class fits the definition of, and its physical conditions closely resemble below poverty line. It is not an exaggeration that about one third of India lives under BPL. A brief visit to the urban and rural condition confirms that there is no synchrony between ground reality and its statistical representation. In any given nation, human resource and its conditioning through schooling is the single most important determining factor for inclusive growth and prosperity. There are incessant perennial discussion on numerous aspects of growth and prosperity throughout the world, but hardly ever they quantify or even refer to the changes in the quality of life of either urban or rural population in the street. Every individual Indian or not must take interest in the direction which India, with its enormous human resource, 18% of world population, is heading to. Under competent and able leadership, this resource could reshape the world, whereas the same human resource under the current Indian leadership appears to be a great burden. It is tempting to speculate how the world would look like if Fidel Castro of Cuba or Nicolas Maduro or Hugo Chavez had access to as great a human resource as India. These questions are generally not discussed in the mainstream print or electronic media, since these are not topics that improve ratings. In an ideal world, information being projected should be for the consumption of those 90% who are victims and casualties of largest democracy. The reality is they are pauperized and destitute masses, segregated and isolated from truth by language barrier. Consequently, they have no access to computer and its built-in English language. Message of our kind therefore can't reach them, and they do not or will not know who works in their interest. But those for whom such messages are not designed probably know every letter being composed and circulated. They also have the power to strip anyone from access to all comfort with a click of a mouse. Let me refer to a presentation of Mr. Jayant Bhandari, based in Canada. He advises famous investors on judicious investment and a prolific writer on subjects related to social, political, and economic affairs. His presentations on India might severely antagonize many Indians because he exposes brutal facts of life in urban and rural India and criticizes moral degradation of the middle class. His presentation of facts, figures, and harsh commentaries are realities that by design are concealed by Indian media. Whereas I know for a fact that facts he delivers are ground realities, but I strongly object to some of his harsh criticism of the victim of the largest democracy and his uncritical admiration of Western virtues. Western media, in contrast to recent past, find it profitable to ignore ugly facts of omnipresent human privations and degradation in India, which is a natural byproduct of the so-called largest democracy. Here is one of his interesting viewpoints. He correctly points out, our government is mainly a symptom of our underlying culture. Let's take a listen.
Our government is merely a symptom of our underlying culture. Those people who spend all their time in activism and fighting the government fail to realize that you have to change your culture before there is any hope.
He says our government is mainly a symptom of our underlying culture. Those people who spend all their time in activism in fighting their government fail to realize that you have to change your culture before there is any hope. Mr. Bhandari explains The transplantation of 1 million Germans in an isolated part of India will transform that part of India and place it on the world map. Similarly, transplantation of 1 million Indians to Frankfurt will in few months will turn Frankfurt into New Delhi. Here, listen to this.
Really, you can move 1 million Germans to an isolated part of India, and I absolutely guarantee you that that isolated part will start becoming visible on the world map within a few years. Similarly, you can move 1 million Indians to Frankfurt, and I guarantee you, if not in weeks, in a few months, Frankfurt will start looking like New Delhi.
He refers to the city of Surrey in Vancouver, British Columbia, which he says is mini India, but a very sanitized version. But it is a black spot on the landscape of Canada, with regular shooting, gang warfare, and unsolved crime cases. These people left India, but India never left them. This also tells you, he says, cultural poison that Surrey and Indians provide to the Canadian society. Listen to him.
Not far from where we are sitting, a mere 30-minute walk from here is a mini India. It's called the city of Surrey. It's a very sanitized version of India though, but it's a black spot on the landscape of Canada. With regular shootings, gang warfare, and unsolved crime cases. Those people who live in Vancouver pretty much know what I'm talking about here. Now, these people left India, but India never left them. Were Surrey an independent country, it would, from bottom up, develop into a tyranny. This also tells you about the cultural poison that Surrey and Indians provide to the Canadian society.
There is great deal of truth in his statement as far as the current state of affairs are concerned, but it must be pointed out that many of these criticisms might fit German society before 1933, or China before 1949, or Russia before 1914, or even London during Oliver Twist of Charles Dickens. For Indians, it is far more relevant to understand why things are the way it is. Simple answer is, those who profit from the kind of widespread ancestral misery being referred here are the one controlling state power behind the mask of largest democracy. Never in the recorded history, the minority privileged class in control of state power has ever surrendered control to the majority whom they exploit and benefit from. Next question is, degradation of Indian culture that Mr. Bhandari so eloquently but harshly narrates are brutal facts of life. Instead of reacting with emotion and denial about such criticism, Indians should try to understand the genesis of this degradation. A society turns into a prison as a given economic system forces misery and deprivation on the people, and their protest is met with savage brutality. Let us take a look at a clipping which I have extracted from Mr. Bhandari's presentation to show this multitude of nervous people whose pathetic savings are threatened are left to themselves with police and their caretaker. These people, in the judgment of the government whom these tortured masses themselves have elected just few years ago, do not think that before tampering with their meager life savings, they deserve any notice, any guidance, any assistance other than savagery from uniformed hoodlums. Let's hear the narrative of Mr. Bhandari himself.
Let me end this with another video of the demonetization process. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things here. There is this one goon in uniform who is managing to beat up hundreds of people at the same time without any fear of any consequences. These human beings were supposedly the ones who fought against the British for their independence.
For them, the word largest democracy may be used only as a joke. For all practical purpose, these multitude of 90% population are in a prison. Here is another news clipping to substantiate how prison turns inmates into beasts. Here is a prosecutor from the state of Missouri refused to send two teenage boys accused of rape out of fear that prison sentence will eat them alive and cause them more harm. So they were recommended community service instead. Let's take a listen.
They should be in jail, right? In jail, most likely for a very long time, but somehow not. Here's RT's Trinity Chavez with more.
Two Amish brothers in Missouri who admitted to having sex with their 12-year-old sister were able to avoid jail time because a prosecutor said it would be too dangerous for them. The decision now sparking fierce reaction. Meantime, the decision sparking fierce backlash. The prosecutor defending his decision, saying the two men would have been eaten alive in the state prison system.
The entire society of India is an open-air prison, and it has been this way not only during the colonial period but also during the last 75 years of post-independence. Consequently, all who are in there, be they majority or minority, are being eaten alive in the open-air prison environment. Culture of the Indian middle class, whom Mr. Bhandari is so critical about, could that be a product of prison? Here is his comment.
In any sane society, the middle class is the moral backbone and intellectual backbone of that society. It isn't the case in India. The caste system is not just a caste system in that country, that is in the DNA of the culture of India. The middle class has zero compassion for poor people. They don't really care if hundreds of millions of poor people die in that country. That is the character of the middle class in India. Moreover, the middle class of India thinks they are the most honest people in the country because they pay their taxes. And of course they pay their taxes because their taxes are withheld by the government of India when they get their salaries. Now, this middle class is the same middle class that is the biggest collector of bribes and corruption in that country.
Middle class is also the product of prison culture. In total disregard of logic and reasoning, India is propagated to be largest democracy because Anglo-American media brands it so. Let us for a moment ponder over the question why West is busy preaching India as the largest democracy despite the barbaric character of its socio-political system and savage treatment inflicted on its people in their daily life, as we have shown. This time it's a clip from the statement of the Prime Minister of Pakistan. He explains that $1,640 billion are being siphoned out of third world countries into the developed, rich countries in collaboration with the native government of elites in the form of organized money laundering, bribes, and tax evasion by multinational corporations. The amount of so-called aid handed out to the poor countries is minuscule compared to what is siphoned out. Let us hear the Prime Minister.
We welcome the interim report of the FACTI panel. The figures of illicit flows mentioned in the report are staggering. $1 trillion is taken out each year by these white-collar criminals. $20 to $40 billion is in the form of bribes received by these corrupt white-collar criminals. $7 trillion in stolen assets is parked in these safe tax haven destinations. $500 to $600 billion is lost each year in tax avoidance by multinational companies.
This drainage is not ending up in China or Russia or Brazil. A well thought out design and meticulous planning from Anglo-American West operates behind this money laundering scheme, and they benefit from this drainage. Prime Minister continues.
In my address to the General Assembly last year, I had highlighted the tremendous damage that illicit financial flows from developing countries to rich countries and to offshore tax havens cause. This leads to the impoverishment of the developing nations. Money that could be used towards human development is siphoned off by corrupt elites. The loss of foreign exchange causes currency depreciation. That in turn leads to inflation and poverty. The quest for getting back these stolen resources is nearly impossible, given the cumbersome procedures. Moreover, the powerful money launderers have access to the best lawyers. And sadly, because they are the beneficiaries, there is a lack of political will in the rich countries to curb this criminal activity.
It is absolutely essential, not only for the lavish life, but even for the survival, to devise a mechanism of siphoning out of resources from the third world countries. This is what they have been doing for the last 2 centuries. Now the mechanism of siphoning have become much more refined and subtle, but effect is the same: one-way traffic. It must be pointed out that West did not come to third world with a large invading army, but thoughtfully exploited local contradictions of the natives to build an army, police, and bureaucracy. Native forces faithfully served the West to subjugate their own people for centuries. Prime Minister's explanation makes it clear that a qualitative transformation of the mechanism of siphoning has taken place with far better result in favor of the West. Without a doubt, a large crew of third world intellectuals are tricked and trapped into actively participate in building and maintaining the siphoning machinery. It is naive to think that West will ever cooperate in curbing one-way traffic of resources, which is the key to their power and prosperity. I do not know the figures, but considering India's volume of natural and human resources, a major share of figure $1.7 trillion annual drainage quoted by the Prime Minister must be included in the figure. That 90% of India is victim of ancestral poverty is most definitely linked to this process of siphoning. In a scenario where one-way drainage of massive national resources remain intact, nation remains splintered into caste, creed, language, religion, and custom, whole nation divided into rich and poor, steadily concentration of wealth leading to pauperization, low or no quality schooling for the poor. Good schooling means scavenging on Anglo-American leftovers. Correction of all these anomalies are entrusted to elected parliament, where every other member is a criminal and every third one is a semi-illiterate. During the last 100 years, a given colonial country, after 75 years of so-called independence, remains infested with all the wounds of poverty, corruption, and injustice, remains under the stranglehold of Anglo-American West, and yet becomes prosperous by following parliamentary democracy. This has never happened. This will not happen. There are countries that have become prosperous and prestigious by adopting means other than parliamentary democracy. West works overtime to demonize them and strangle them to the best of their ability. Those practice futile parliamentary democracy are projected as angel or largest democracy. Net result is their prime minister is left with no other choice but to beg and plead to the wolf to change their heart and thus stop hounding on the flock. It is up to you to decide after listening to this presentation whether India is on its way to become a great power, or will it remain appendage of the West and its Anglophonic crowd be branded as contemptible clowns.